The lake had always been quiet in a way that felt earned. It wasn't the kind of peace you stumble upon by accident. It was the kind that came from generations of restraint, from families who understood that nature didn't need improvement, only respect. The water stretched wide and clean, bordered by tall pine trees that had seen more winters than anyone alive. Early mornings brought fog that hovered low, and evenings ended with reflections so clear they felt staged. This lake wasn't public. It wasn't shared. It wasn't part of any neighborhood agreement or HOA jurisdiction. It belonged to my family, legally and historically. The land deeds were old, passed down with stories of how the shoreline was protected from overdevelopment long before lakefront luxury became a buzzword. The boat ramp on the eastern edge was private too, built decades earlier for family use and the occasional guest. Nothing flashy. Just concrete, steel rails, and a locked gate. For years, nothing disturbed that balance. Then the neighborhood arrived. The HOA community was built uphill, far enough away that at first it seemed harmless. A gated cluster of oversized homes, manicured lawns, and decorative stone signs announcing exclusivity. Their marketing materials bragged about lake proximity, even though none of their land touched the water. That phrasing alone should have been the first warning sign. Proximity has a way of turning into entitlement when enough money is involved. At first, the changes were subtle. More boats idling near the shoreline. Strangers drifting closer than before. Weekend noise creeping later into the evening. Each time, it stopped just short of confrontation. Just enough to raise questions, not enough to trigger action. Then one morning, the lake looked wrong. It wasn't dramatic at first glance. No smoke. No alarms. Just something unfamiliar floating near the center, far from shore but unmistakably artificial. A wide platform. Anchored. Squared edges where there should been none. Over the next few days, it grew. Railings appeared. Tables. A structure that rose slightly above the waterline, blocking reflections that had been uninterrupted for decades. A floating restaurant. Not a dock. Not a temporary barge. A full-service dining platform with staff boats, generator noise, and lighting rigs mounted high enough to glow at night. All of it placed squarely on private water without a single notice, permit discussion, or acknowledgement. No one asked. No one warned. They just built it. The HOA's involvement became obvious quickly. Boats bearing their logo ferried supplies. Their security patrols hovered nearby, waving off curious onlookers. Marketing banners began appearing on social media, advertising exclusive lakefront dining experiences, with sunset views. Reservation only. Premium pricing. The kind of event meant to signal status rather than enjoyment. Every single guest arrived the same way. Through my family's boat ramp. At first, I assumed it was temporary confusion. Maybe a mistake. Maybe someone assumed shared access. But the gate had been forced open. Not broken. Forced. The lock replaced with a newer one I didn't recognize. Security cameras adjusted. Signs added that didn't belong there. Private property rewritten overnight by people who believed wealth replaced permission. Cars lined the access road. Valets directed traffic as if they'd always been there. Guests arrived dressed for photographs rather than weather. Expensive jackets. Dresses unsuited for docks. Everything about it screamed intrusion masked as elegance. The lake became loud. Generators hummed constantly. Music carried across the water late into the night. Boats cut across protected areas, stirring sediment that had never been disturbed. Wildlife retreated. Fishing died off within days. What had been a natural soundscape was replaced by the clink of glassware and the low murmur of entitled laughter. Still, no one spoke to me. No letter. No legal notice. No meeting request. The HOA acted as though the lake had been waiting for them. Research confirmed what I already knew. The water rights were clear. The lake was private. No shared access agreements existed. The floating structure violated multiple environmental protections. The boat ramp trespass alone was enough to shut the operation down immediately. But enforcement takes time. Time the HOA was using to make money. Peak dinner hours became a spectacle. Boats stacked up near the ramp. Staff rushed supplies back and forth. Guests complained loudly when delays occurred, unaware they were standing on land they had no right to step on. Every night the operation continued felt like a calculated gamble that no one would push back hard enough. They underestimated one thing. I wasn't angry yet. I was watching. Patterns emerged quickly. The restaurant relied entirely on that single ramp. No alternate access. No backup plan. Everything from food deliveries to emergency services depended on it. Without that ramp, the restaurant didn't just struggle. It ceased to exist. The HOA had built something impressive, but fragile. A luxury experience balanced on a single assumption, that no one would dare interfere. That assumption was their first mistake. I documented everything. Boat traffic. Security changes. Trespassing incidents. Environmental damage. Every night the restaurant operated illegally added weight to what was coming. The HOA board continued promoting the venue, leaning harder into exclusivity, raising prices, and attracting a clientele that assumed inconvenience was something that happened to other people. The lake had always been patient. So was I. But patience has limits. And once those limits are crossed, the response doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be precise. By the end of the week, reservations were booked solid. Influencers teased sunset dinners. The HOA celebrated what they believed was a successful expansion of their authority. They had no idea how temporary that success was. Because everything they built depended on access they never owned. And soon, they were going to learn exactly what happens when you mistake silence for permission. By the time the second week rolled in, the floating restaurant had fully settled into its routine. The HOA treated it like a crown jewel, the kind of project meant to silence critics and impress outsiders. Social media posts showed smiling diners clinking glasses against the sunset, captions dripping with exclusivity. What those posts never showed was the trail of disruption left behind, or the fact that every single plate of food, every staff member, and every guest depended on one quiet stretch of concrete that never belonged to them. The boat ramp had become the artery of the entire operation. From early afternoon onward, the access road filled with vehicles. Delivery vans unloaded crates of food and drink. Staff cars parked wherever they could fit. Valets acted like they were running a luxury marina instead of trespassing on private land. The gate that had once marked a clear boundary now stood wide open, guarded by hired security who assumed authority simply because they wore uniforms. I watched it all without interfering. Not because I couldn't stop it, but because timing mattered. Peak dinner hours became predictable. Around sunset, traffic surged. Boats queued up on the water, idling impatiently as staff rushed to keep things moving. The floating restaurant glowed brighter as night fell, lights reflecting off the water in a way that felt invasive rather than beautiful. Noise carried farther now, bouncing off the surrounding hills. The lake, once calm, felt crowded and restless. That night, everything lined up perfectly. Reservations were fully booked. A private event had been advertised. Luxury guests arrived expecting seamless service. The HOA board members were present, circulating proudly, convinced they had pulled off something untouchable. That was when the ramp disappeared. There was no confrontation. No shouting. No dramatic announcement. Just a locked gate, reinforced barriers, and clear signage restored to its original position. Security cameras activated. Access revoked cleanly and legally, the way it should have been from the start. From the road, confusion spread first. Cars slowed. Valets froze. Staff made phone calls that went unanswered. Guests stepped out of their vehicles, dressed for fine dining, staring at a gate they had never noticed before. The sense of certainty evaporated almost instantly. People who had arrived expecting service suddenly found themselves stranded on the wrong side of ownership. On the water, the effect was even more immediate. Boats that had already dropped off diners returned to find the ramp inaccessible. Others, scheduled to shuttle guests back and forth, circled helplessly. Supplies stopped moving. Staff boats ran low on fuel. The restaurant, still floating confidently in the center of the lake, was suddenly isolated. Inside, the experience unraveled quickly. Service slowed. Drinks ran out. Food orders backed up. Guests grew restless, then irritated. The kind of irritation that comes from realizing money doesn't fix everything. Staff scrambled, not knowing how to explain what was happening without admitting the truth. They were operating somewhere they had no right to be. Calls started flying. First to the HOA board. Then to private security firms. Then to local authorities. Each call followed the same path, each ending the same way. The lake wasn't under HOA control. The ramp was private property. The closure was legal. There was nothing anyone could force open. For the first time, the HOA faced a situation they couldn't vote away. Guests tried alternatives. Some attempted to walk around the barrier. Others argued with security who suddenly realized they had no authority there. A few demanded refunds before dessert had even been served. The carefully curated luxury atmosphere cracked under pressure, revealing how thin it had always been. On the floating restaurant, the mood shifted from celebration to panic. Staff whispered. Managers paced. The music lowered, then stopped entirely. The glow of lights felt harsh now, exposing rather than enhancing. Diners checked their watches. Phones came out. Messages were sent. Complaints were drafted before the night had even ended. And then the real problem emerged. There was no emergency access. If something went wrong on that platform, help would be delayed. The HOA had never secured proper permissions because they assumed control would follow construction. That assumption had now trapped dozens of people on a structure with limited supplies and no legal exit point. Authorities arrived, not to reopen anything, but to observe. Environmental officers documented violations. Property officials reviewed boundaries. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The floating restaurant should never have existed in the first place, at least not there. The ramp closure wasn't retaliation. It was restoration. By the time the evening ended, the damage was done. Guests were ferried away hours late through improvised solutions that cost the HOA more money than they had made that night. Refunds were issued. Apologies were drafted. Social media posts quietly disappeared. The exclusive experience became a cautionary tale overnight. But the HOA didn't back down. Instead, they escalated. The next morning brought letters, threats, and public statements dripping with confidence. The board framed the closure as interference. They claimed shared usage rights that didn't exist. They promised legal action, confident that pressure would force compliance. They still believed this was about inconvenience. They still believed this was a bluff. What they didn't understand was that the ramp was only the beginning. The floating restaurant had attracted attention far beyond what the HOA could control. Environmental agencies were now involved. Local officials had questions. Permits were reviewed that had never been issued. Every corner the HOA had cut was now under a spotlight they couldn't dim. The lake, quiet again for the first time in weeks, felt like it was holding its breath. And so was the HOA. Because once authorities start looking closely, they don't stop at the surface. They dig. They trace decisions. They follow money. And what they were about to uncover would turn a bad night into a full-scale collapse. The HOA thought the locked ramp was the punishment. They were wrong. It was just the warning. The days following the ramp closure were quiet in a way that felt heavy. Not peaceful, but tense. The kind of silence that settles in after something irreversible has already happened. The floating restaurant still sat on the water, untouched and inactive, like a monument to overconfidence. Boats no longer circled it. Lights stayed off at night. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but everyone involved knew it was being watched closely. The HOA went into damage control mode immediately. Publicly, they projected confidence. Statements were released claiming misunderstandings, shared access disputes, and temporary closures for logistical review. Privately, panic spread. Board members scrambled to piece together permits that didn't exist and approvals that had never been granted. Lawyers were contacted, then replaced. Consultants were brought in to assess risk, only to confirm what no one wanted to hear. The project was indefensible. Environmental regulators were the first to act. Inspections revealed anchoring damage to the lakebed, fuel runoff, and disturbances to protected shoreline areas. Each violation stacked on top of the last, carrying fines that grew larger with every report. What the HOA had treated as a luxury amenity was now classified as an unauthorized commercial structure operating on private water. Then came the property findings. Surveyors confirmed the lake boundaries in detail, mapping ownership lines that cut cleanly through the HOA's assumptions. The floating restaurant sat entirely outside their jurisdiction. The boat ramp, access road, and surrounding land were indisputably private. The forced access, replaced locks, and security presence weren't gray areas. They were documented acts of trespass. That was when the narrative flipped. The HOA stopped being the organizer of an exclusive experience and became the subject of an investigation. Emails were subpoenaed. Financial records were reviewed. Contracts with vendors and construction teams were examined for accountability. Each discovery revealed the same pattern: decisions made quickly, warnings ignored, and legal steps skipped in favor of speed and prestige. Residents began asking questions. Homeowners who had been promised increased property values learned instead about potential liabilities. Insurance carriers re-evaluated coverage. Fees were raised to cover mounting legal costs. Suddenly, the floating restaurant wasn't a symbol of success. It was a financial sinkhole dragging everyone down with it. Anger turned inward. Board members resigned. Others distanced themselves publicly, claiming they had been misled. Meetings grew heated. Confidence fractured. The same authority that had pushed the project through without resistance now struggled to maintain basic control over its own community. And then the final decision arrived. The floating restaurant was ordered removed. Not relocated. Not modified. Completely dismantled. Every day it remained on the water added penalties the HOA could no longer afford. Contractors were brought back, this time not to build, but to undo everything. Sections were towed away. Anchors pulled. Platforms broken down piece by piece. The lake began to heal. Water clarity slowly returned. Wildlife crept back into areas they had abandoned. The noise vanished, replaced by the natural rhythm that had existed long before the HOA's arrival. What had taken weeks to disrupt took months to repair, but the process had begun. The aftermath didn't end there. Civil actions followed. Vendors demanded payment. Guests sought refunds beyond what had already been issued. Insurance claims were denied. The HOA faced scrutiny not just from authorities, but from its own residents, many of whom felt betrayed by leadership that had gambled with their money and reputation. The board that approved the floating restaurant never fully recovered. Elections reshaped leadership. Policies tightened. Ambitions shrank. The community that once believed it could extend control beyond its borders learned a costly lesson about limits. Authority, it turned out, wasn't something you could build on water and expect to hold. As for the ramp, it returned to its original state. Locked. Quiet. Untouched. The way it had always been meant to be. No valets. No banners. No assumptions. Just a boundary respected again. There was no victory parade. No public celebration. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that restraint had won over entitlement. That patience, paired with precision, had been enough. The lake didn't need defending with noise or anger. It only needed its ownership acknowledged. The floating restaurant became a story people told carefully, usually with embarrassment. A reminder of what happens when money moves faster than permission. When power forgets its limits. When an HOA confuses proximity with ownership. And for everyone involved, one truth became impossible to ignore. Some things aren't meant to be claimed. They're meant to be left alone.